If
Yes.
yes,
Okay.
perfect.
Excellent.
Well, you missed all the thanks part, but anyway, I will talk about our recent fieldwork in Sardis and my research on the Lydian society here tonight. So to begin with a broader look at this ancient site, Sardis is located in Western Anatolia, about an hour drive east of Izmir. Thanks to its central position that connects coastal Western and inland Anatolia and its wonderfully rich resources, Sardis maintained its importance for many centuries. It is among the longest lived sites in Anatolia. So when I mention Sardis, I'm not talking about just one city, but the dozens of them built on top of each other in the same central location. And even today, the modern village site, built into the ancient city's burial grounds, recognizes the name of Sardis. So throughout history, many travelers visited Sardis and studied its topography, monuments, and inscriptions. They all seem to have admired the Acropolis of Sardis. This high citadel was refortified by a fortress in the Byzantine period, mostly using spolia from earlier edifices in the city. Despite the fact that Byzantine period represents a general decline in the number of sites in Western Anatolia, the extent of construction in the Acropolis bears witness to Sardis' continued importance. An ongoing project by Ben Anderson and Jordan Pickett target the documentation of this hard-to-access citadel with specific questions in mind, such as when and how it was built. Sardis was a flourishing city in the Roman times as well, especially from the 5th century AD. It is said that one of the 7 Asiatic churches of the Book of Revelations was located in Sardis. Along with other churches and basilicas, the citizens of Sardis also built the largest synagogue of the Roman world here, which we recently moved to protect the building and its mosaics from further weathering. Sardis also saw the construction of many civic structures in this period, for instance, a Bach gymnasium complex, a stadium, city walls, and a monumental arch that marks the entry to the city with the largest opening so far known in the Roman world. Well, these all came down in 1 or 2 devastating earthquakes in the early 7th century AD. Now, this gives us, lucky archaeologists, a frozen moment in time. So our team is currently uncovering their remains to better understand the course of these construction and destruction events, as well as the lives of Roman Sardians. And in the early Roman era, Sardis was such an important city that it was awarded by the Roman emperors the royal title of a neocrate 3 times. This title of honor was given only to the cities that built temples for the Roman emperors or that established cults of the imperial family members. Our ongoing fieldwork in Sardis targets one of these imperial cult temples, along with the late Roman structures I mentioned earlier, which dismantled and rebuilt it. Earlier, Sardis was under control of 2 succeeding Hellenistic kingdoms, firstly the Seleucids and then the Attalids. In this era, Sardis became a truly Hellenic city. The language of diplomacy switched to Greek. Civic structures typical of a Greek palace were built for the first time here. For instance, a theater, a hippodrome, a gymnasium, and possibly a city council. Yet none of them were as glamorous as the Temple of Artemis, the 4th largest Ionic temple in the world. So 2 new volumes, one on this temple by Fikret Yegül, and one on different aspects of Hellenistic life in Sardis by Andrea Berlin and Paul Kaufman, have come out in recent years. When Alexander the Great visited Sardis and opened this Hellenistic era here, the city was under the Persian Empire's rule. It was then the Western satrapal capital, where Persian kings and satraps had meetings and oversaw diplomatic relations. They also used Sardis as a base for their wars with the Greek world. When Sardis was first captured by the Persian king Cyrus in 1947 BC, it was sacked and burned, and its inhabitants were forced out of the former city. So they continued modest lives in the environs of Sardis, as opposed to the Persian rulers, whose monumental burials with rich offerings attest to their wealth. Now, I said all of this to underline a single thing. Sardis was always an important city, but from the Persian conquest onwards, it remained under the hegemony of larger political entities, Turks, Byzantines, Romans, Greeks, and Persians. But there was a time Sardis was the sovereign capital of a mighty empire, that of the Lydians. So who were these Lydians? The Lydians were an Anatolian people. They spoke a language derived from the ancestral branch of Indo-European languages, Proto-Anatolian. By this language, the Lydians were cousins to the Hittites, Luvians, Karlians, and Lycians. Based on linguistic studies, Lydians entered Anatolia sometime in the late 3rd millennium BC, so in the early Bronze Age. But whether they settled in the Hermes Valley right away is a matter of ongoing debate. Well, its details are beyond the scope of this talk, but to give you some idea, 3 major ideas are looming around. One of them places the Bronze Age Lydians in Mysia as Myonians, that is north of the Hermes Valley, and suggests that they moved south at the end of the 2nd millennium BC. Another one suggests that they came directly to this region upon their entry to Anatolia. And the last one adds that they lived here together with the Luvians throughout the 2nd millennium BC. Unfortunately, we know nothing about this early history through the Lydians' own literary accounts, because they adopted writing only after the 8th century BC. Plus, they commonly wrote on gravestones, so their texts do not necessarily provide references to historical events. That's why we mostly rely on later Greek and Roman resources. The most notable of them is the histories of Herodotus. Herodotus outlines 3 major dynasties of Lydia. The earliest Adyad dynasty is entirely mythical, perhaps fabricated by Herodotus himself to give the Lydians a legendary background similar to that of the Greeks. He also narrated the succeeding Heraclic dynasty in a fanciful tone. Imagine a gluttonous king, Completus, waking up to see that he devoured his own wife, or a powerful King Meles walking his pet lion to the side on the outline of the fortifications. In scholarship, this Heraclic dynasty is traditionally placed between the 12th and the 7th century BC, but they're mostly considered pseudo-historical because we barely had any archaeological findings to act in accord with the Heraclids, but our recent discoveries at Sardis is greatly changing this picture. So one of the goals of my talk tonight is to provide you with that archaeological evidence. Now back to Herodotus, he talks about the last Lydian dynasty, the Myrmnads, in much greater detail. If we follow this common narrative, the Myrmnads turned Lydia into a full-fledged kingdom in the early 7th century BC. You see that core area by dark purple on the map. Back then, Lydia was surrounded by powerful polities in its east, such as Phrygia, Urartu, and the Assyrian Empire, which subjugated all of the Syro-Anatolian principalities. Then the Myrmnad kings, particularly Aliates and Croesus, expanded Lydia into an empire until the mid-6th century BC and controlled most of Western Anatolia, that is the light purple area. And during this expansion, as Herodotus described, they attacked and subjugated Eastern Greek settlements, played an important role in international politics, and warred and signed treaties with the big powers of their time. So this account is well substantiated in the archaeological record. Lydian production and Lydian style material remains appear outside the core region in this period of expansion and show signs of Lydia's growing influence. These crafts and architecture include ceramics and coins, architectural terracottas, defensive mud brick structures, and cut stone tomb chambers. Certain Eastern Greek settlements also provide plausible evidence for the Myrmnad king's attack. As an example, a ginormous earthen deposit found against the face of the city wall at Smyrna is interpreted as the siege mound of Aliates. But the Lydians established good connections with them as well. To this point, Lydian ceramics, particularly Lydions and vessels with marble decoration, turn up at Aegean settlements. Vice versa, numerous imports from Greece and Ionia populate the 7th and 6th century levels in Sardis. We also know that the Myrmnad kings consulted with Greek oracles, made lavish donations to their temples, and in certain cases, helped build their sanctuaries. For instance, the famous Artemision of Ephesus preserved coins minted by the Lydian king Aliates and inscriptions that document benefactions of his son Croesus. So the Myrmnad kings also glorified their capital city by a series of ambitious building programs. The city was encircled by ginormous mud brick fortifications from the late 7th century BC onwards. Being 20-meter thick, supported with another 20-meter wide glacis, The mass of these walls has no rival in Anatolia. This wall extended 3.5 kilometers surrounding the lower city and the Mernak Kings and the Mernak Kings palatial complex. The royal complex was situated on two of the naturally elevated central hills. We call them Bisford and Field 49. Their rugged topography was regularized by cubical promontories by monumental urban terraces. These terrace platforms were built of massive limestone and schist rock, which were transported from long distances to Sardis. They converted the topography specifically to create the place for the palatial buildings. That's why we consider them as deliberate acts of elite placemaking and symbolic representation of the growing Mernak power. Yet, when these terraces at Bisford was first discovered in the 1980s, archaeologists interpreted them as part of an extramural sanctuary outside of Sardis, because they didn't know what the true extent of the city. Let me explain this a bit further. Systematic field research in Sardis began in the 1950s. To decide where to dig, Sardis team quite reasonably followed what the historical accounts said about the city's location. Their main reference was, again, Herodotus. He described the famous Acropolis citadel and the city at its foothills located along the Pactolus River. So initial trenches at Sardis were sunk into these areas. Among these trenches, Hob was particularly important because it provided the deepest stratigraphic levels, dating all the way back to the late Bronze Age. The pre-7th century levels here and elsewhere produced weak domestic architecture and mostly locally made ceramics with only occasional imports. Thus, they considered Sardis as a small and dispersed settlement in the early first millennium BC. On the contrary, Mernak period Sardis appeared to have a busy center with its gold refinery, workshops, and mud-brick dwellings. Based on the Lydian findings along the Pactolus, the density of Hellenistic and Roman structures further to the east, they thought that the city must have moved eastwards in post-Lydian times. When the full circle of Lydian fortifications was discovered in early 2000s, however, it became evident that the Lydian Sardis actually laid under those classical remains. And these later programs followed the urban structure and alignment already established by the Lydians. Sardis team also realized that the city indeed moved, but in the 5th BC, when Herodotus was probably writing about Information is quite important because it showed that initial trenches were all outside fortifications. So what they offered was actually the glimpses into the suburb of the city. Yet there was a silver lining to these excavations. As opposed to many other digs in Anatolia, we have learned so much about the culture and the lifestyles of ordinary Sardians very early on. Since 2000 then, we directed our investigations into the city within the fortifications. Our new trenches in the center and re-evaluation of former records helped identify the center as the Imperial palatial complex. Here, two topics form the core of my ongoing research. First is the imperialization process. Scholars who investigate this topic try to identify outward changes from the imperial center. We observe these changes in the standardization of material classes of a wide region, as the core imposes specific traditions on subject lands. We also encounter diversity based on the degrees of adaptive interests and cultural resilience of peripheral communities. Yet one must remember that these relationships are two-way, and sometimes it is the outward periphery whose signs are manifested in the imperial center. So in my research, I'm investigating these signs at Sardis in its process of becoming an imperial capital. Second is the pace of these political developments. As I have shown, archaeological research so far pointed that the growing power of Mernaks in Anatolia was late and quite sudden, without any power structures before the 7th century. But the royal power resided in Sardis before the Mernaks, according to Herodotus. So where are those power structures? The answer to that question only came recently from the Imperial palatial complex itself. Our ongoing fieldwork here exposed a long sequence of monumental building programs dating back to around 2000 BC. As striking is the extent of continuity in material and architectural concepts we observe here. So I will briefly go over these fresh off the ground structures to demonstrate how they set the scene for the imperial constructions. So now, occupation at the center begins at the turn of the 3rd millennium BC. In field 49, we have evidence for major landscape modifications in the form of terrace hills. This discovery is again quite significant because this projected early Bronze Age terrace initiated the long-term Lydian tradition of terracing exactly in the same location as the Myrnats glacial complex. In the late Bronze Age, occupation covered most of field 49 hill. It consisted of large-scale mud brick buildings with stone foundations. Their collapsed deposits included a rich collection of ceramics, similar to those from prominent Western Anatolian sites, such as Troy, Beyce Sultan, and closer at home, Kaymakçı. When viewed together with the pseudo-citadels in the Hermes Valley, Sardis stands out as a central place in this region. And occupation was continuous from the late Bronze Age to the early Iron Age elsewhere in Sardis, but at the central precinct, we observe a break in monumental constructions. So far, we know it recommences in the 9th century BC. In this period, terraced elite residences covered the tips of both fields 49 and Bisford. There were 2-story structures built of mud brick with substantial timber frameworks. Their semi-subterranean design and multi-tier placement on slopes also required extensive landscape modification. So they're kind of the continuation of the early Bronze Age terraces here. Besides, they inherited many features from the late Bronze Age, such as building alignments and materials, as well as certain ceramic traditions. And in the second half of the 8th century BC, central precinct was regularized by polygonal terraces. Its architecture used schist boulders, followed specific alignments along the hill, and converted the lower slopes by significant alterations to the previous landscape. This meant they sometimes cut formal Lydian forefills and bedrock, and sometimes filled in the slopes of the hill. Now let's consider these early Lydian constructions at the center with their contemporaries in the suburbs. Their comparisons suggest a significant divergence. The terraced residences in the center were built much larger in size and scale. They were also built of harder to acquire, therefore costlier materials, such as green clay, loads of timber, boulder-sized schist stones, each weigh more than 1 ton. Plus, these heavy materials had to be hauled up to the top of the high hills, so they required large builder crews working simultaneously. As you see our attempt to move 1 block out of my trench using simple rollers. In the center, these builder crews also applied top-down decisions as the strict alignments of these terraced residences suggest. While they converted to topography, the center's elevated position with an unobstructed view allowed the inhabitants to observe their transformative performances. Thus, these buildings events were visible from anywhere in the settlement, and they became a public spectacle. Plus, their dominant locality is likely to have restricted access to these complexes. So this center must have been perceived as the center of administrative control. In sum, this ages-old center was physically, visually, and mentally demarcated as the place of an early Lydian elite before the Myrnats. Now, the sequence of elite complexes has greater implications on our understanding of early Lydian society. Pre-Myrnat Sardis was previously interpreted as a dispersed small town. This was based on initial discoveries in the suburbs. Now, if we plot the location of the newly discovered complex, what we get is, firstly, a much larger settlement than previously anticipated, and secondly, a much more centralized settlement with a substantially built and rich core. So housing the Lydian elite, this center and its lower settlement reflect an at least two-tier social organization here. Now, having laid these foundations, now let's turn to Imperial Sardis to tackle our other question. What are the material manifestation of imperialization at the core capital? I will talk about two lines of evidence here. One is increasing settlement hierarchy. So Sardis reached its largest extent in the 6th century BC, covering an area of about 200 hectares. To give you a sense, this makes about 300 soccer fields put together. The city, of course, comprised diverse functional units, but what's more important is that these areas were divided by monumental construction projects, which continue to create a hierarchical socio-spatial organization. The highest tier was the Myrnad palatial complex, extending from the Acropolis into the elevated center by monumental terraces, and they were perhaps connected by tunnels as well. Between the palatial complex and the fortifications were residential areas of well-to-do inhabitants who formed the second tier in this organization. Our understanding of these common residences is still limited, as we can investigate them in only small areas and very deep trenches. I can confidently say two things, however. Firstly, the Lydian dwellings at the foothills of the palatial complex were similarly organized by terraces. We know that from the few meter deep fills exposed under the 6th century Lydian house at field 55. Secondly, the area within the city wall comprised rich domestic neighborhoods, as we know from two excavation sectors, the theater and MMS. The Persian destruction here provided excellent preservation conditions for these houses. They were typically 1 to 2 room buildings built of mud brick with stone foundations, and they included rich material assemblages, including considerable amount of imports from the Greek world. And outside the city walls, occupation was continuous for about 2.5 kilometers, including a wider variety of functions, and it is thanks to these early field campaigns that we know about them. There were mixed-use residential areas, such as marketplaces and houses with workshops in the hub and PC sectors, as well as industrial facilities at Sector PN, such as the gold refinery, or with its renewed interpretation, a recycling center for electrum coins. Finally, in this extramural zone, Cagliari holds some significance. This is a naturally elevated hill across the Lydian necropolis and above the post-Lydian temple of Artemis. The hill was regularized by monumental terrace constructions as well, and it was abandoned after the Lydian period. Here we located a large cache of architectural terracottas that are similar to ones found in archaic Greek temples. Thus, this area could have been used as a sanctuary by the Lydians. Now, I have given you a glimpse of what Lydian capital looked like, and if we summarize, Sardis in this period had a hierarchical social-spatial organization, mainly achieved by monumental constructions of Aliates and Croesus. And this organization represents a multi-tier ranking typical of imperial capitals. The other line of evidence for imperialization is the shift towards hybridity in monumental constructions, particularly in the palatial terraces and fortifications. Now that you have seen the early Lydian terraces in the city center, it will be no surprise to you that the Myrnad elite also invested in the same area as their predecessors and continued their terracing practices. But constructions were much larger in scale, and they came with certain novelties, such as the use of limestone as a building material, new ashlar masonry and clamping techniques, as well as extensive use of painted architectural terracottas for buildings. Besides, a large-scale program was applied. This program consisted of terraces placed on multi-tiers on the slopes of both Field 49 and Bisford, and it might have provided the hills with a truncated pyramid-like appearance in the late 7th century BC. Yet, In the following century, we observe a major shift in the design of this complex, from step terraces to high-standing podium-type platforms to support and showcase the palatial buildings. This new program joined the central hills into a single complex and converted them into cubical flat-top promontories. To realize this conversion, builders partly dismantled the former terraces and partly buried them entirely. So enormous amounts of earth and rubble filled in the steep slopes of these hills, thus forming the core of the platforms. These were the actual means of accomplishing the cubical design to recreate a new place for the palace of Croesus. Support such massive hills, builders of course needed such massive walls as well. Limestone ashlars and work polygonal boulders were simultaneously used to build them. In the end, the design of Croesus's palatial terrace was so monumental that it still has its imprints on today's landscape that we can trace on the ground. Unfortunately, we cannot see the actual palatial architecture in this photo, but after these palatial buildings were raised on the platforms without any obstruction in sight, they would have towered over the settlement and instilled a sense of administrative command and control. The material finds in this complex also point to the palatial use of the area. Just to name a few of these luxury objects: a jasper seal, fragments of bronze sculpture, bone and ivory furniture bits, imported ceramics, nicely polished marble basins, and painted architectural terracottas. So in this sense, the palatial complex of the Mernat was not so much different from those of the Iron Age capitals in Anatolia. They all sat on dominant locations, adorned by monumental constructions, as well as a rich cachet of luxury goods. So this way, the central precinct of Sardis acted as a palatial citadel and maintained the Anatolian concept of royal placemaking. But there's one major difference. The Lydians never fortified their palatial complex. Instead, they demarcated it by multi-tier elite residences and terraces throughout centuries. So the question is, what changed in the 6th century to foster the shift in the complex design to a platform? To answer this question, we first need to turn our heads to the Aegean. Here, we also observe a major development, the emergence of Greek temples that were raised on artificial platforms. In Greece, these platforms appear as early as the late century BC, for instance, at Hargai-Pharaon and Samos-Harayon. And in Western Anatolia, similar applications appear in the 7th century BC, for instance, at the early phases of the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus and Athena Temple at Smyrna. Now let's take a look at the shift in light of the development in the Greek world. In a sense, the new 6th century platform design of the palatial terrace resembles those of the early temples, raised on the platform and made especially open to view without enclosures. So I think that Croesus's increasing relationship with the Greek world, as he donated to the temples and helped build them, seems to have triggered some concepts of hybridity. Instead of building a Greek-style temple at Sardis, he seems to have adopted their platform design and implemented it into his own palace with the continued practice of terrace construction. Now, this was the first bit of my argument for conceptual hybridity that reflects expanding connections of the Lydian Empire. And the second bit will be about the city wall of Sardis. This city wall was built in 2 major phases from the late 7th to the 6th centuries BC. The late 7th century phase that belonged to the period of Aliatis was 20 meters thick at its base. It was built of mud bricks, resting a stone circle that was reinforced by wooden matting and stone foundations. The mud brick superstructure had an inclined face. In the second phase of the 6th century BC, the period of Croesus, an earthen glacis was added to the defensive system. Looking at its cut section, you can notice the striations. Can you notice striations? Yes, you can. Striations of different earth used in its construction. This glacis brought a total width of the city wall to 40 meters at its base. And in this phase, parts of this mud brick wall was dismantled and replaced by much higher stone walls, on top of which a mud brick structure again stood. During this replacement, stone recesses were added in between the sections of the glacis. And we think it likely that their function was to tie the glacis to the first outer face of the wall, so the structure would have looked like this, as you see in the reconstruction. So what was the point of building such a massive wall? The size, morphology, and design of this wall altogether suggests that its primary function was defensive. Several skeletal remains were found in the wall's collapsed deposits. Apparently, there were soldiers who died during the Persian attacks defending their hometown. These skeletons were in the company of armory, such as one Lydian helmet and other war equipment like sling stones, arrowheads, and knives. And one of these soldiers was found carrying one sling stone in one hand and another one stuck on his head, possible cause of his poor fella. I hinted earlier at another function of this wall, to demarcate and segregate specific areas, such as intramural elite residences and extramural lower status households. So one other symbolic function of this wall is related to its size and scale. As I try to demonstrate, the city wall was colossal. However, size and scale can be relative terms in different contexts. The circuit of Sardis wall has affinities to some of the Iron Age sites in Anatolia, such as the Phrygian capital Gordion in the 8th century or Karkanes in the 7th century, but they were built much thinner than the Sardis walls. But this thickness is Sardis wall's thickness is comparable only to the fortifications of old Bayraklı Smyrna. But the circuit of this Ionian site is much shorter. So overall, considering the overall investment, the Lydian fortification finds parallels only in Mesopotamia at Neo-Assyrian sites, such as Khorsabad and Nimrud. So the Imperial Lydian kings seem to have emulated the Assyrian mode of power display. Besides, this scale would have made the wall visible from long distances by anyone approaching Sardis. So the symbolic function of the wall must make a statement about the power that resided in the capital city. So how big of an investment are we talking about? Labor costs I will provide here are preliminary and include estimations of labor for mud brick production only. These are kindly provided by the Director of Sardis Archaeological Explorations for Professor Nick Cahill. The fortification have two stretches, one thicker and one thinner. The Lydian bricks, however, are highly varied in their sizes. Nick Cahill grouped them under two standards as large and small. And if we think that the fortification was built of smaller bricks, it would have required about 74.5 million bricks. But in fact, the wall uses larger bricks more than the smaller. So Nick Cahill thinks that we should account for the lower estimate of 37.1 million bricks. In Sardis, we experimented with manufacturing mud bricks as well. In these timed experiments, a crew of 4 workers who knew nothing about mud brick making produced 150 bricks in one day. So one person manufactured about 37 to 38 bricks. In the reconstruction of Hartusha fortifications, this amount was 120 bricks a day. And Max Mallowan, the former director of Nimrud, estimated that one experienced bricklayer can manufacture 100 bricks in a day. So if we take this in-between rate, we see that the mud brick portion of the Lydian fortification would have been completed between 5 to 6.5 years, based on a crew of 250 men working throughout the year. If we consider two things now, the population of 6th century Sardis could have provided 500 men to work for the construction throughout the year. I mean, they could have easily done that. And these local laborers would be familiar with Lydian building culture. Here, an important question arises. Why then do we observe such variety in the city walls construction techniques, particularly in the second phase? So my argument here is that Lydian kings drew labor from subject lands of Lydia, but for this argument, we need to examine more closely the stylistic design principles and architectural elements. In fact, Sardis fortifications constitute a long-term Anatolian model of timber-reinforced mud brick architecture. We're familiar with this tradition from palatial and defensive constructions in notable Bronze Age sites in central and western Anatolia. Also, we can observe the continuation of this practice in local Sardis context from at least the 15th century BC onwards. So the decision to pursue this model, I believe, displays the Lydian rulers' ties to certain ancestral building practices, and in this way, they accentuated their deep roots in Anatolia. Yet towards the 6th century BC, we also observe a step towards eclecticism, representing the Lydian Empire's far-reaching connections. One such element is baked bricks. The top of Sardis city wall, its walkable surfaces and crenellations were probably capped by baked bricks. Unfortunately, we cannot find a single baked brick in situ as the top of the wall was destroyed during the Persian attack, but we have numerous examples in its destruction debate. So to contextualize this, brick baking is not a known tradition in Anatolia, but it's a well-known practice in Assyria and Babylonia from the 9th century BC onwards, such as in the walls of Shalmaneser III's throne room at Nimrud. The other important architectural element added to the defensive system was the glacis. The glacis has a deep history on its own, but well-preserved early examples in Anatolia are again from the Bronze Age. For instance, the earthen rampart at Limantepe fortifications and the stone glacis of Yerkapı at the Hittite capital Hattusha. And the Anatolian custom of building glacis continued into the Iron Age, either as stepped stonework or battered masonry. We commonly observe this practice in the Neo-Hittite and Phrygian defensive systems between the 9th and 7th centuries BC. The Lydians seem to have adopted this long-term tradition, but with one significant difference: the Lydian glacis was built of earth and was supported by stone retaining walls at its recesses. At Phocaia and Clazomenae in Ionia, two later subjects of Lydia, the glacis was also applied as smoothed limestone surfaces later in the 6th century BC. The last and most possibly diverse architectural element of Sardis fortification is its stone masonry techniques, and I will begin with talking about ashlars. Early examples of ashlar masonry, long before their construction at Sardis, appear again in Anatolia and Assyria. One very good example is the nicely rusticated anthracite blocks of the 13th century Hittite sanctuary Eflatun Pınar. Around the time when Sardis fortifications were built, Neo-Syrian imperial capitals already had nicely worked limestone masonry with rustication. We find them at the gates and towers of Sennacherib's Nineveh and at the base of Sargon's palatial platform at Khorsabad, which included holes for metal dowels, a practice also well known in Lydian stone architecture. And if we turn our eyes to the Eastern Greek world, we also begin to see notable examples of ashlar masonry, some which are contemporaneous with Sardis city wall. These include the archaic fortification walls of Pergamon, blocks of the Peripterus in the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus, commissioned by Croesus himself, and the ashlars of the 6th century fortifications at Phocaia. Chris Rete argued in his book, Lydian Architecture, that the Lydians adopted the typology of limestone ashlars from the Assyrians, but developed these construction techniques in Western Anatolia, hand in hand with the Eastern Greeks. He further argued that the Lydian masons were the intermediaries in the transmission of ashlar construction from east to the west. Well, this is a well-placed argument, but because Rattray concentrated only on ashlar masonry, he rather disregarded the multiplicity of masonry techniques in Lydian architecture, which is a marvelous trait of these fortifications. In the stone recesses, we come across stone walling with roughly squared blocks, similar to those in archaic fortifications of Miletus, and polygonal masonry, similar to those in the fortifications of Samos and Mindos in the 7th century BC. We also observe a masonry type called the lesbian technique that is traditionally accepted to originate from the Aegean island Lesbos. This technique was applied in Sardis, and good contemporary examples of such can be found particularly in Larissa. We similarly observe, if we briefly turn to the 6th century polygonal terraces of Croesus' palatial complex, we observe the same variety in their construction, even in a single stretch of the terrace wall. So, with these observations, how do we interpret the hybridity in monumental constructions in Sardis from the late 7th to the 6th centuries BC? The majority of the parallels come from Western Anatolian sites. So I argue that this shift can be a result of Masons coming from subject lands of the Lydian Empire, particularly Ionia, to build Croesus' fortifications. This in itself is a reflection of Lydia's expanding territory and connections. And if we sum it all up, our recent research in Sardis is exposing the history of the Lydian society in the Hermes Valley with millennia-long continuities observed in the same settlement. Moreover, the new discovery and studies of monumental early Lydian constructions in the Myrmidon palatial complex also provide a substantial background to their kingdom and the later empire. So we now have started to reverse the narrative of their late and sudden political development in Iron Age Anatolia. A further look at Imperial Sardis, we see an increasingly hierarchical society, and this seems to have been achieved by continued monumental defensive and terrace constructions. Their ambitious scales and hybridity in design and styles tell further tales about Lydian Sardis and its rulers. Firstly, the last two Lydian kings, Adliatis and Croesus, who were the builders of the Lydian Empire and the decision makers of the overall design of these monumental projects. It is obvious that these Lydian kings emulated the Neo-Assyrian grandeur and the ways they actualized power through commissioning large-scale architecture. This point is further strengthened by the adoption of certain architectural elements. So we can envision Alyattes and Croesus as propagandist emulators who saw themselves as rivals to the kings of the great Near Eastern empires. Yet, these imperial Lydian kings also displayed ties to their Anatolian roots by pursuing ancestral architectural traditions. This is particularly observed in the continued terracing practice in the elite sector and use of the long-term Anatolian model of mud brick defenses. In the meantime, we can characterize them as receptive to peripheral architectural traditions. This becomes apparent in their combination of concepts from the Greek world with their own, while allowing the use of diverse masonry techniques instead of seeking standardization throughout their imperial capital. And I think this is how the Lydian rulers displayed their imperial ideology that built bridges between the East and the West. Thank you so much for your attention.